Note B of Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Cardinal Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bill McGillivray. Note B, Ecclesiastical Miracles. The writer who gave occasion for the foregoing narrative was very severe with me for what I had said about miracles in the preface to the Life of St. Walburga. I observe therefore as follows. Catholics believe that miracles happen in any age of the Church, though not for the same purpose, in the same number, or with the same evidence, as in apostolic times. The Apostles wrought them in evidence of their divine mission, and with this objective they have been sometimes wrought by Evangelists of countries since, as even Protestants allow. Hence we hear of them in the history of St. Gregory in Pontus, and St. Martin in Gaul, and in their case, as in that of the Apostles, they were both numerous and clear. As they are granted to Evangelists, so are they granted, though in less measure in evidence, to other holy men, and as holy men are not found equally at all times and in all places, therefore miracles are in some places and times more than in others. And since generally they are granted to faith and prayer, therefore in a country in which faith and prayer abound, they will be more likely to occur, than where and when faith and prayer are not, so that their occurrence is irregular. And further, as faith and prayer obtain miracles, so still more commonly do they gain from above the ordinary interventions of Providence. And, as it is often very difficult to distinguish between a providence and a miracle, and there will be more providence than miracles, hence it will happen that many occurrences will be called miraculous, which strictly speaking are not such, that is, not more than providential mercies, or what are sometimes called grazie or favours. Persons who believe all this, in accordance with Catholic teaching, as I did and do, they on the report of miracles will of necessity, the necessity of good logic, be led to say, first, it may be, and secondly, but I must have good evidence in order to believe it. 1. It may be, because miracles take place in all ages, it must be clearly proved, because perhaps after all it may be only a providential mercy, or an exaggeration, or a mistake, or an impostor. Well, this is precisely what I had said, which the writer who has given occasion to this volume considered so irrational. I had said, as he quoted me, in this day and under our present circumstances, we can only reply that there is no reason why they should not be. Surely this is good logic, provided that miracles do occur in all ages. And so again, I am logical in saying, there is nothing prima facie in the miraculous accounts in question to repel a properly taught or religiously disposed mind. What is the matter with this statement? My assailant does not pretend to say what the matter is, and he cannot, but he expresses a rude, unmeaning astonishment. Accordingly, in the passage which he quotes, I observe, miracles are the kind of facts proper to ecclesiastical history, just as instances of sagacity or daring, personal prowess or crime, are the facts proper to secular history. What is the harm of this? 2. But, though a miracle be conceivable, it has to be proved. What has to be proved? 1. That the event occurred as stated, and is not a false report or an exaggeration. 2. That it is clearly miraculous, and not a mere providence or answer to prayer within the order of nature. What is the fault of saying this? The inquiry is parallel to that which is made about some extraordinary fact in secular history. Supposing I hear that King Charles II died a Catholic, I am led to say, it may be, but what is your proof? In my essay on miracles of the year 1826, I proposed 3 questions about a professed miraculous occurrence. 1. Is it antecedently probable? 2. Is it in its nature certainly miraculous? 3. Has it sufficient evidence? To these 3 heads I had regard in my essay of 1842, and under them I still wish to conduct the inquiry into the miracles of ecclesiastical history. So much for general principles. As to St. Walburga, though I have no intention at all of denying that numerous miracles have been wrought by her intercession, still neither the author of her life, nor I, the editor, felt that we had grounds for binding ourselves to the belief of certain alleged miracles in particular. I made, however, one exception. It was the medicinal oil which flows from her relics. Now as to the verisimilitude, the miraculousness, and the fact of this medicinal oil. 1. The verisimilitude. It is plain there is nothing extravagant in this report of her relics having a supernatural virtue, and for this reason, because there are such instances in Scripture, and Scripture cannot be extravagant. For instance, a man was restored to life by touching the relics of the prophet Elias. The sacred text runs thus: "And Elisha died, and they buried him. And the bands of the Moabites invaded the land at the coming in of the year. And it came to pass, as they were burying a man, that, behold, they spied a band of men, and they cast the man into the sepulchre of Elisha. And when the man was let down, and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived, and stood upon his feet." Again, in the case of an inanimate substance which had touched a living saint, and God wrought special miracles by the hands of Paul, so that from his body were brought unto the sick handkerchiefs or aprons, and the disease departed from them. And again, in the case of a pool, an angel went down at a certain season into the pool, and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in, was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. 2 Kings, 4 Kings, Roman numeral 13, section 20, 21. Acts, Roman numeral 19, section 11 and section 12. John, verse 4. Therefore there is nothing extravagant in the character of a miracle. 2. Next, the matter of fact. Is there an oil flowing from St. Walburga's tomb, which is medicinal? To this question I confine myself in my preface. Of the accounts of medieval miracles, I said that there was no extravagance in their general character, but I could not affirm that there was always evidence for them. I could not simply accept them as facts, but I could not reject them in their nature. They might be true, for they were not impossible, but they were not proved to be true, because there was not trustworthy testimony. However, as to St. Walburga, I repeat, I made one exception, the fact of the medicinal oil, since for that miracle there was distinct and successive testimony. And then I went on to give a chain of witnesses. It was my duty to state what those witnesses said in their very words, so I gave the testimonies in full, tracing them from the saint's death. I said, "She is one of the principal saints of her age and country." Then I quoted Besnage, a Protestant, who says, "6 writers are extant, who have employed themselves in relating the deeds or miracles of Walburga." Then I said that her renown was not the mere natural growth of ages, but begins with the very century of the saint's death. Then I observed that only 2 miracles seem to have been distinctly reported of her as occurring in her lifetime, and they were handed down apparently by tradition. Also that such miracles are said to have commenced about A.D. 777. Then I spoke of the medicinal oil as having testimony to it in 893, in 1306, after 1450, in 1615, and in 1620. Also I said that Mabillon seems not to have believed some of her miracles, and that the earliest witness had got into trouble with his bishop. And so I left the matter, as a question to be decided by evidence, not deciding anything myself. What was the harm of all this? But my critic muddled it together in most extraordinary manner, and I am far from sure that he knew himself the definite categorical charge which he intended it to convey against me. One of his remarks is, "What has become of the holy oil for the last 240 years? Dr. Newman does not say," page 25. Of course I did not, because I did not know. I gave the evidence as I found it. He assumes that I had a point to prove, and then asked why I did not make the evidence larger than it was. I can tell him more about it now. The oil still flows. I have had some of it in my possession. It is medicinal still. This leads to the third head. 3. Its miraculousness. On this point, since I have been in the Catholic Church, I have found there is a difference of opinion. Some persons consider that the oil is the natural produce of the rock, and has ever flowed from it; others, that by a divine gift it flows from the relics; and others, allowing that it now comes naturally from the rock, are disposed to hold that it was in its origins miraculous, as was the virtue of the pool of Bethsaida. This point must be settled, of course, before the virtue of the oil can be ascribed to the sanctity of St. Walburga. For myself, I neither have, nor ever have had, the means of going into the question, but I will take the opportunity of its having come before me to make one or two remarks, supplemental of what I have said on other occasions. 1. I frankly confess that the present advance of science tends to make it probable that various facts take place, and have taken place, in the order of nature, which hitherto have been considered by Catholics as simply supernatural. 2. Though I readily make this admission, it must not be supposed in consequence that I am disposed to grant at once that every event was natural in point of fact, which might have taken place by the laws of nature, for it is obvious no Catholic can bind the Almighty to act only in one and the same way, or to the observance always of His own laws. An event which is possible in the way of nature is certainly possible too to divine power, without the sequence of natural cause and effect at all. A conflagration, to take a parallel, may be the work of an incendiary, or the result of a flash of lightning; nor would a jury think it safe to find a man guilty of arson, if a dangerous thunderstorm was raging at the very time when the fire broke out. In like manner, upon the hypothesis that a miraculous dispensation is in operation, a recovery from diseases to which medical science is equal may nevertheless in matter of fact have taken place, not by natural means, but by supernatural interposition. That the lawgiver always acts through his own laws is an assumption, of which I never saw proof. In a given case, then, the possibility of assigning a human cause for an event does not ipso facto prove that it is not miraculous. 3. So far, however, is plain, that till some experimentum crucis can be found, such as to be decisive against the natural cause or the supernatural, an occurrence of this kind will as little convince an unbeliever that there has been a divine interference in the case, as it will drive the Catholic to admit that there has been no interference at all. 4. Still there is this gain accruing to the Catholic cause from the larger view we now possess of the operation of natural causes, namely, that our opponents will not in future be so ready as hitherto to impute fraud and falsehood to our priests and their witnesses, on the ground that they are pretending or reporting things that are incredible. Our opponents have again and again accused us of false witness on account of statements which they now allow as either true or may have been true. They account indeed for the strange facts very differently from us, but still they allow that facts they were. It is a great thing to have our characters cleared, and we have reasonable hope that, the next time our word is vouched for occurrences which appear to be miraculous, our facts will be investigated, not our testimony impugned. 5. Even granting that certain occurrences, which we have hitherto accounted miraculous, have not absolutely a claim to be so considered, nevertheless they constitute an argument still in behalf of revelation and the Church. Providence, or what are called grazie, though they do not rise to the order of miracles, yet, if they occur again and again in connection with the same persons, institutions, or doctrines, may supply a cumulative evidence of the fact of a supernatural presence in the quarter in which they are found. I have already alluded to this point in my essay on ecclesiastical miracles, and I have a particular reason, as will presently be seen, for referring here to what I said in the course of it. In that essay, after bringing its main argument to an end, I append to it a review of the evidence for particular alleged miracles. It does not strictly fall within the scope of the essay, I observe, to pronounce upon the truth or falsehood of this or that miraculous narrative, as it occurs in ecclesiastical history, but only to furnish such general considerations as may be useful in forming a decision in particular cases. Page CV. However, I thought it right to go farther, and to set down the evidence for and against certain miracles as we meet with them. Ibid. In discussing these miracles separately, I make the following remarks, to which I have just been referring. After discussing the alleged miracle of the thundering legion, I observe, nor does it concern us much to answer the objection, that there is nothing strictly miraculous in such an occurrence, because sudden thunderclouds after drought are not unfrequent. For I would answer, grant me such miracles ordinarily in the early Church, and I will ask no other. Grant that upon prayer benefits are vouchsafed, deliverance are effected, unhoped for results obtained, sickness cured, tempests laid, pestilence put to flight, families remediated, judgments inflicted, and there will be no need of analyzing the causes, whether supernatural or natural, to which they are to be referred. They may or they may not, in this case or that case, follow or surpass the laws of nature, and they may do so plainly or doubtfully. But the common sense of mankind will call them miraculous, for by a miracle is popularly meant, whatever be its formal definition, an event which impresses upon the mind the immediate presence of the moral governor of the world. He may sometimes act through nature, sometimes beyond or against it, but those who admit the fact of such interference will have little difficulties in admitting also their strictly miraculous character, if the circumstances of the case require it, and those who deny miracles to the early Church will be equally strenuous against allowing her the grace of such intimate influence, if we may so speak, upon the course of divine providence, as is here in question, even though it be not miraculous. Page CXXI. And again, speaking of the death of Arius, but after all, was it a miracle? For if not, we are laboring at a proof of which nothing comes. The most immediate answer to this question has already been suggested several times. When a bishop with his flock prays night and day against a heretic, and at length begs of God to take him away, and when he is suddenly taken away, almost at the moment of his triumph, and that by a death awfully significant, from its likeness to one recorded in Scripture, is it not trifling to ask whether such an occurrence comes up to the definition of a miracle? The question is not whether it is formally a miracle, but whether it is an event, the like of which persons who deny that miracles continue will consent that the Church should be considered still able to perform. If they are willing to allow the Church such extraordinary protection, it is for them to draw the line to the satisfaction of people in general, between these strictly miraculous events. If on the one hand they deny their occurrence in the times of the Church, then there is sufficient reason for our appealing here to the history of Arius in proof of the affirmative. Pages CLXXII. These remarks, thus made upon the thundering legion and the death of Arius, must be applied in consequence of investigation made since the date of my essay to the apparent miracle wrought in favor of the African confessors in the Vandal persecution. Their tongues were cut out by the Arian tyrant, and yet they spoke as before. In my essay I insisted on this fact as being strictly miraculous. Among other remarks, referring to the instances adduced by Middleton and others in disparagement of the miracles, namely, of a girl born without a tongue, who yet talked as distinctly and easily as if she had enjoyed the full benefit of that organ, and of a boy who lost his tongue at the age of 8 or 9, yet retained his speech, whether perfectly or not, I said, does Middleton mean to say that, if certain of men lost their tongues at the command of a tyrant for the sake of their religion, and then spoke as plainly as before, nay, if only one person was so mutilated and so gifted, it would not be a miracle? Page CCX. And I enlarged upon the minute detail of the fact as reported to us by eyewitness and contemporaries. Out of the 7 writers adduced, 6 are contemporaries, 3, if not 4, are eyewitnesses of the miracle. One reports from an eyewitness, and one testifies to a fervent record at the burial place of the subject of it. All 7 were living, or had been staying at one or other of the 2 places which are mentioned as their abode. One is a pope, a second a Catholic bishop, a third a bishop of a schismatical party, a fourth an emperor, a fifth a soldier, a politician, and a suspected infidel, a sixth a statesman and courier, a seventh a rhetorician and philosopher. He cut out the tongue by the roots, says Victor, Bishop of Vito. I perceive the tongue entirely gone by the roots, says Aeneas. As low down as the throat, says Procopius. At the roots, say Justinian and St. Gregory. He spoke like an educated man, without impediment, says Victor of Vito. With articulateness, says Aeneas, better than before. They talked without any impediment, says Procopius. Speaking with perfect voice, says Marcellinus. They spoke perfectly, even to the end, says the second Victor. The words were formed, full and perfect, says St. Gregory, pages CCVIII. However, a few years ago, an article appeared in Notes and Queries, number for May 22, 1858, in which various evidence was adduced to show that the tongue is not necessary for articulate speech. 1. Colonel Churchill, in his Lebanon, speaking of the cruelness of Djezzar Pacha, in extracting to the root of the tongue of some emirs, adds, "It is a curious fact, however, that the tongue grows again sufficiently for the purpose of speech." 2. Sir John Malcolm, in his Sketches of Persia, speaks of Zab Khan of Krisht, who was condemned to lose his tongue. This mandate, he says, was imperfectly executed, and the loss of half of this member deprived him of speech. Being afterwards persuaded that its being cut close to the root would enable him to speak so as to be understood, he submitted to the operation, and the effect has been that his voice, though indistinct and thick, is yet intelligible to persons accustomed to converse with him. I am not an anatomist, and I cannot therefore give a reason why a man, who could not articulate with half a tongue, should speak when he has none at all, but the facts are as stated. 3. And Sir John McNeill says, "In answer to your inquiries about the powers of speech retained by persons who have had their tongues cut out, I can state from personal observation that several persons, whom I knew in Persia, who had been subjected to that punishment, spoke so intelligibly as to be able to transact important business. The conviction in Persia is universal, that the power of speech is destroyed by merely cutting off the tip of the tongue, and is to a useful extent restored by cutting off another portion, as far back as a perpendicular section can be made of the portion that is free from attachment at the lower surface. I never had to meet with a person who had suffered this punishment, who could not speak so as to be quite intelligible to his familiar associates. I should not be honest if I professed to be simply converted by these testimonies to the belief that there was nothing miraculous in the case of the African confessors. It is quite as fair to be skeptical on one side of the question as on the other, and if Gibbon is considered worthy of praise for his stubborn incredulity in receiving the evidence for this miracle, I do not see why I am to be blamed if I wish to be quite sure of the full appositeness of the recent evidence which is brought to its disadvantage. Questions of fact cannot be disproved by analogies or presumptions. The inquiry must be made into the particular case in all parts, as it comes before us. Meanwhile, I fully allow that the points of evidence brought into disparagement of the miracle are prima facie of such cogency, that, till they are proved to be irrelevant, Catholics are prevented from appealing to it for controversial purposes. End of Note B to Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Cardinal Newman. Note C and Note D of Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Cardinal Newman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Note C. Sermon on Wisdom and Innocence. The professed basis of the charge of lying and equivocation made against me, and in my person against the Catholic clergy, was, as I have already noticed in the preface, a certain sermon of mine on Wisdom and Innocence, being the 20th in a series of sermons on subjects of the day, written, preached, and published while I was an Anglican. Of this sermon my accuser spoke thus in his pamphlet: "It is occupied entirely with the attitude of the world to Christians and the Church. By the world appears to be signified especially the Protestant public of these realms. What Mr. Newman means by Christian and the Church, he has not left in doubt, for in the preceding sermon he says, 'But if the truth must be spoken, what are the humble monk and the holy nun and other regulars, as they are called, but Christians after the very pattern given us in Scripture,' etc." This is his definition of Christians, and in the sermon itself he sufficiently defines what he means by the Church in 2 notes of her character, which he shall give in his own words. What, for instance, though we granted that sacramental confession and the celibacy of the clergy do tend to consolidate the body politic in the relation of rulers and subjects, or, in other words, to aggrandize the priesthood? For how can the Church be one body without such relation? Pages 8 and 9. He then proceeded to analyze and comment on it at great length, and to criticize severely the method and tone of my sermon generally. Among other things he said, "What then did the sermon mean? Why was it preached? To insinuate that a Church which had sacramental confession and a celibate clergy was the only true Church? Or to insinuate that the admiring young gentlemen who listened to him stood to their fellow countrymen in the relation of the early Christians to the heathen Romans? Or that Queen Victoria's government was to the Church of England what Nero's or Diocletian's was to the Church of Rome? It may have been so. I know that men used to suspect Dr. Newman, I have been inclined to do so myself, of writing a whole sermon, not for the sake of the text or of the matter, but for the sake of one single passing hint, one phrase, one epithet, one little barbed arrow, which, as he swept magnificently past on the stream of his calm eloquence, seemingly unconscious of all presence, save those unseen, he delivered unheeded, as with his finger-tip, to the very heart of an initiated hearer, never to be withdrawn again. I do not blame him for that. It is one of the highest triumphs of oratoric power, and may be employed honestly and fairly by any person who has the skill to do it honestly and fairly. But then, why did he entitle his sermon Wisdom and Innocence? What then could I think that Dr. Newman meant? I found a preacher bidding Christians imitate, to some undefined point, the arts of the basest of animals, and of men and of the devil himself. I found him, by a strange perversion of Scripture, insinuating that St. Paul's conduct and manner were such as naturally to bring down on him the reputation of being a crafty deceiver. I found him, horrible to say it, even hinting the same of one greater than St. Paul. I found him denying or explaining away the existence of that priestcraft, which is a notorious fact to every honest student of history, and justifying, as far as I can understand him, the double dealing by which prelates in the Middle Age too often played off alternately the sovereign against the people, and the people against the sovereign, careless which was the right, so long as their own power gained by the move. I found him actually using of such, and, as I thought, of himself and his party likewise, the words, "They yield outwardly, to assent inwardly were to betray the faith." Yet they are called deceitful and double-dealing, because they do as much as they can, and not more than they may. I found him telling Christians that they will always seem artificial, and wanting in openness and manliness, that they will always be a mystery to the world, and that the world will always think them rogues, and bidding them glory in what the world, that is, the rest of their countrymen, disown, and say with Mawworm, "I like to be despised." Now, how was I to know that the preacher, who had the reputation of being the most acute man of his generation, and of having a special intimate acquaintance with the weakness of the human heart, was utterly blind to the broad meaning and the plain practical result of a sermon like this, delivered before frantic and hot-headed young men, who hung upon his every word, that he did not foresee that they would think that they obeyed him by becoming affected, artificial, sly, shifty, ready for concealment and equivocations, etc., etc. Pages 14 through 16. My accuser asked in this passage, what did the sermon mean, and why was it preached? I will here answer this question, and with this view will speak, first of the matter of the sermon, and then of its subject, then of its circumstances. 1. It was one of the last 6 sermons which I wrote when I was an Anglican. It was one of the 5 sermons I preached in St. Mary's between Christmas and Easter, 1843, the year when I gave up my living. The MS of the sermon is destroyed, but I believe, and my memory too bears me out, as far as it goes, that the sentence in question about celibacy and confession, of which this writer would make so much, was not preached at all. The volume in which the sermon is found was published after that I had given up St. Mary's, when I had no call on me to restrain the expression of anything which I might hold, and I stated an important fact about it in the advertisement, in these words: in preparing these sermons for publication, a few words and sentences have in several places been added, which will be found to express more of private or personal opinion than it was expedient to introduce into the instruction delivered in church to a parochial congregation. Such introduction, however, seems unobjectionable in the case of compositions which are detached from the sacred place and service to which they once belonged, and submitted to the reason and judgment of the general reader. This volume of sermons then cannot be criticized at all as preachments. They are essays of a man who, at the time of publishing them, was not a preacher. Such passages as that in question are just the very ones which I added upon my publishing them, and as I always was on my guard in the pulpit against saying anything which looked towards Rome, I shall believe that I did not preach the obnoxious sentence till some one is found to testify that he heard it. At the same time I cannot conceive why the mention of sacramental confession, or of clerical celibacy, had I made it, was inconsistent with the position of an Anglican clergyman. For sacramental confession and absolution actually form a portion of the Anglican visitation of the sick, and though the 32nd Article says that bishops, priests, and deacons are not commanded by God's law either to vow the state of single life or to abstain from marriage, and therefore it is lawful for them to marry, this proposition I did not dream of denying, nor is it inconsistent with St. Paul's doctrine, which I held, that it is good to abide even as he, that is, in celibacy. But I have more to say on this point. This writer says, I know that men used to suspect Dr. Newman, I have been inclined to do so myself, of writing a whole sermon, not for the sake of the text or of the matter, but for the sake of one simple passing hint, one phrase, one epithet. Now observe, can there be a plainer testimony borne to the practical character of my sermons at St. Mary's than this gratuitous insinuation? Many a preacher of Tractarian doctrine has been accused of not letting his parishioners alone, and of teasing them with his private theological notions. The same report was spread about me 20 years ago as this writer spreads now, and the world believed that my sermons at St. Mary's were full of red-hot Tractarianism. Then strangers came to hear me preach, and were astonished at their own disappointment. I recollect the wife of a great prelate from a distance coming to hear me, and then expressing her surprise to find that I preached nothing but a plain humdrum sermon. I recollect how, when on the Sunday before commemoration one year, a number of strangers came to hear me, and I preached in my usual way, residents in Oxford of high position were loud in their satisfaction that on a great occasion I had made a simple failure, for after all there was nothing in the sermon to hear. Well, but they were not going to let me off, for all my common-sense view of duty. Accordingly they got up their charitable theory, which this writer revives. They said that there was a double purpose in those plain addresses of mine, and that my sermons were never so artful as when they seemed commonplace; that there were sentences which redeemed their apparent simplicity and quietness. So they watched during the delivery of a sermon, which to them was too practical to be useful, for the concealed point of it, which they could at least imagine, if they could not discover. Men used to suspect Dr. Newman, he says, of writing a whole sermon, not for the sake of the text of the matter, but for the sake of one single passing hint, one phrase, one epithet, one little barbed arrow, which, as he swept magnificently past on the stream of his calm eloquence, seemingly unconscious of all presence, save those unseen, he delivered unheeded, etc. To all appearance, he says, I was unconscious of all presence. He is not able to deny that the whole sermon had the appearance of being for the sake of the text and matter, therefore he suggests that perhaps it wasn't. 2. And now as to the subject of the sermon. The sermons of which the volume consists are such as are, more or less, exceptions to the rule which I ordinarily observe, as to the subjects which I introduced into the pulpit of St. Mary's. They are not purely ethical or doctrinal. They were for the most part caused by circumstances of the day or of the moment, and they belong to various years. One was written in 1832, 2 in 1836, 2 in 1838, 5 in 1840, 5 in 1841, 4 in 1842, 7 in 1843. Many of them were engaged on one subject, namely, in viewing the Church in its relation to the world. By the world was meant not simply those multitudes which were not in the Church, but the existing body of human society, whether in the Church or not, whether Catholic, Protestant, Greek, or Mohammedans, theists or idolaters, as being ruled by principles, maxims, and instincts of their own, that is, of an unregenerated nature, whatever their supernatural privileges might be, greater or less, according to their form of religion. This view of the relation of the Church to the world, as taken apart from questions of ecclesiastical politics, as they may be called, is often brought out in my sermon. Two occur to me at once. Number 3 of my plain sermons, which was written in 1829, and number 15 of my third volume of Parochial, written in 1835. On the other hand, by the Church I meant, in common with all writers connected with the tract movement, whatever their shades of opinion, and with the whole body of English divines, except those of the Puritan or Evangelical school, the whole of Christendom, from the Apostles' time till now, whatever their later divisions into Latin, Greek, and Anglican. I have explained this view of the subject above at pages 69 and 71 of this volume. When then I speak, in the particular sermon before us, of the members or the rulers, or the action of the Church, I meant neither the Latin, nor the Greek, nor the English, taken by itself, but of the whole Church as one body, of Italy as one with England, of the Saxon or Norman as one with the Caroline Church. This was specially the one Church, and the points in which one branch or one period differed from another were not and could not be notes of the Church, because notes necessarily belong to the whole of the Church, everywhere and always. This being my doctrine as to the relation of the Church to the world, I laid down in a sermon 3 principles concerning it, and there left the matter. The first is, that divine wisdom had framed from its action laws, which man, if left to himself, would have antecedently pronounced to be the worst possible for its success, and which in all ages have been called by the world, as they were in the Apostles' days, foolishness. That man ever relies on physical or material force, and on carnal inducements, as Mohammed with his sword and his houris, or indeed almost as that theory of religion calls, since the sermon was written, muscular Christianity; but that our Lord, on the contrary, has substituted meekness for haughtiness, passiveness for violence, and innocence for craft, and that the event has shown the high wisdom of such an economy, for it has brought to light a set of natural laws, unknown before, by which the seeming paradox that weakness should be stronger than might and simplicity than worldly policy, is readily explained. Secondly, I said that men of the world, judging by the event and not recognizing the secret cause of the success, namely a higher order of natural laws, natural, though their source and action were supernatural, for the meek inherit the earth by means of a meekness which comes from above. These men, I say, conclude that the success which they witness must arise from some evil secret which the world has not yet mastered, by means of magic, as they said in the first stages, by cunning, as they say now, and accordingly they thought that the humility and inoffensiveness of Christians, or of churchmen, was a mere pretense and blind to cover the real cause of that success, which Christians could explain and would not, and that they were simply hypocrites. Thirdly, I suggested that shrewd ecclesiastics, who knew very well that there was neither magic nor craft in the matter, and, from their intimate acquaintance with what actually went on within the Church, discern what were the real causes of its success, were of course under the temptation of substituting reason for conscience, and instead of simply obeying the command, were led to do good that good might come, that is, to act in order to secure success, and not from a motive of faith. Some, I said, did yield to the temptation more or less, and their motives became mixed, and in this way the world in a more subtle shape had got into the Church, and hence it had come to pass that, looking at its history from first to last, we could not possibly draw the lines between good and evil there, and say either that everything was to be defended, or certain things to be condemned. I expressed the difficulty, which I suppose to be inherent in the Church, in the following words. I said, priestcraft has ever been considered the badge, and its imputation is a kind of note of the Church, and in part indeed truly, because the presence of powerful enemies, and the sense of their own weakness, has sometimes tempted Christians to the abuse, instead of the use of Christian wisdom, to be wise without being harmless, but partly nay, for the most part not truly, but slanderously, and merely because the world called their wisdom craft, when it was found to be a match for its own numbers and power. Such is the substance of the sermon, and as to the main drift of it, it was this, that I was there and elsewhere scrutinizing the course of the Church as a whole, as if philosophically, as an historical phenomenon, and observing the laws in which it was conducted. Hence the sermon, or essay, as it more truly is written in a dry and unimpassioned way. It shows as little of human warmth of feeling as a sermon of Bishop Butler's. Yet under that calm exterior there was a deep and keen sensitiveness, as I shall now proceed to show. 3. If I mistake not, it was written with a secret thought about myself. Every one preaches according to his frame of mind at the time of preaching. One heaviness especially oppressed me at that season, which this writer, 20 years afterwards, has set himself with a good will to renew. It arose from the sense of the base calumnies which were heaped upon me on all sides. It is worth observing that this sermon is exactly contemporaneous with the report spread by a bishop, vid. Supra, page 181, that I had advised a clergyman converted to Catholicism to retain his living. This report was in circulation in February 1843, and my sermon was preached on the 19th. In the trouble of mind into which I was thrown by such calumnies as this, I gained, while I reviewed the history of the Church, at once an argument and a consolation. My argument was this: if I, who knew my own innocence, was so blackened by party prejudice, perhaps those high rulers and those servants of the Church, in the many ages which intervened between the early Nicene times and the present, who were laden with such grievous accusations, were innocent also. And this reflection served to make me tender towards those great names of the past, to whom weakness or crimes were imputed, and reconcile me to difficulties in ecclesiastical proceedings, which there were no means now of properly explaining. And the sympathy thus excited for them reacted on myself, and I found comfort in being able to put myself under the shadow of those who had suffered as I was suffering, and who seemed to promise me their recompense, since I had a fellowship in their trial. In a letter to my Bishop, at the time of Tract 90, part of which I have quoted, I said that I had ever tried to keep innocence, and now 2 years had passed since then, and men were louder and louder in heaping on me the very charges which this writer repeats out of my sermon, of fraud and cunning, craftiness and deceitfulness, double-dealing, priestcraft, of being mysterious, dark, subtle, designing, when I was all the time conscious to myself, in my degree and after my measure, of sobriety, self-reliant, and control of word and feeling. I had had experience how my past success had been imputed to secret management, and how, when I had shown surprise at the success, that surprise again was imputed to deceit, and how my honest heartfelt submission to authority had been called, as it was called in a bishop's charge abroad, mystic humility, and how my silence was called in hypocrisy, and my faithfulness to my clerical engagements a secret correspondence with the enemy. And I found a way of destroying my sensitiveness about these things, which jarred upon my sense of justice, and otherwise would have been too much for me, by the contemplation of a large law of the divine dispensation, and felt myself more and more able to bear in my own person a present trial, of which in my past writings I had expressed an anticipation. For this feeling, and thus speaking, this writer compares me to Mawworm. I found him telling Christians, he says, that they will always seem artificial and wanting in openness and manliness, that they will always be a mystery to the world, and that the world will always think them rogues, and bidding them glory in what the world, that is, the rest of their fellow countrymen, disown, and say with Mawworm, I like to be despised. Now, how was I to know that the preacher was utterly blind to the broad meaning and the plain practical result of a sermon like this delivered before fanatic and hot-headed young men who hung upon his every word? Fanatic and hot-headed young men who hung on my every word? If he had undertaken to write a history and not a romance, he would have easily found out, as I have said above, that from 1841 I had severed myself from the younger generation of Oxford, that Dr. Pusey and I had then closed our theological meetings at his house, that I had brought my own weekly evening parties to an end, that I preached only by fits and starts at St. Mary's, so that the attendance of young men was broken up, that in those very weeks from Christmas till over Easter, during which the sermon was preached, I was but 5 times in the pulpit there. He would have found that it was written at a time when I was shunned rather than sought, when I had great sacrifices in anticipation, when I was thinking much of myself, that I was ruthlessly tearing myself away from my own followers, and that in the musings of that sermon I was at the very utmost only delivering a testimony in my behalf for time to come, not sowing my rhetoric broadcast for the chance of present sympathy. Again he says, I found him actually using of such prelates, and, as I thought, of himself and his party likewise, the words, they yield outwardly, to assent inwardly were to betray the faith. Yet they are called deceitful and double-dealing, because they do as much as they can, not more than they may. This too is a proof of my duplicity. Let this writer, in his dealing with some one else, go just a little further than he has gone with me, and let him go into a court of law for libel, and let him be convicted, and let him still fancy that his libel, though a libel, was true, and let us then see whether he will not in such a case yield outwardly, without assenting internally, and then again whether we should please him, if we called him deceitful and double-dealing, because he did as much as he could, not more than he ought to do. But Tract 90 will supply a real illustration of what I meant. I yielded to the bishops in outward act, namely, in not defending the tract, and in closing the series. But, Not only did I not assent inwardly to any condemnation of it, but I opposed myself to the proposition of a condemnation on the part of authority. Yet I was then by the public called deceitful and double-dealing, as this writer calls me now, because I did as much as I felt I could do, and not more than I felt I could honestly do. Many were the publications of the day and the private letters which accused me of shuffling, because I closed a series of tracts, yet kept the tracts on sale, as if I ought to comply not only with what my bishop asked, but with what he did not ask, and perhaps did not wish. However, such teaching, according to this writer, was likely to make young men suspect that truth was not a virtue for its own sake, but only for the sake of the spread of Catholic opinions and the salvation of their own souls, and that cunning was the weapon which Heaven had allowed them to defend themselves against the persecuting Protestant public. Page 16. And now I draw attention to a further point. He says, "How was I to know that the preacher did not foresee that fanatic and hot-headed young men would think that they obeyed him, by becoming affected, artificial, sly, shifty, ready for concealments and equivocations? How should he know? What? I suppose that we are to think every man a knave till he is proved not to be such. No. Had he no friend to tell him whether I was affected or artificial myself? Could he not have done better than impute equivocations to me, at a time when I was in no sense answerable for such apologia of the Roman casuists? Had he a single fact which belongs to me personally or by profession to couple my name with the equivocation of 1843? How should he know that I was not sly, smooth, artificial, non-natural? He should know by that common manly frankness, by which we put confidence in others, till they are proved to have forfeited it. He should know it by my own words in that very sermon, in which I say it is best to be natural, and that reserve is at best but an unpleasant necessity. For I say there expressly, I do not deny that there is something very engaging in a frank and unpretending manner. Some persons have it more than others. In some persons it is a great grace. But it must be recollected that I am speaking of times of persecution and oppression to Christians, such as the text foretells, and then surely frankness will become nothing else than indignation at the oppressor and the vehement speech, if it is permitted. Accordingly, as persons have deep feelings, so they will find the necessity of self-control, lest they should say what they ought not. He sums up thus: if Dr. Newman would persist, as in this sermon, in dealing with matters dark, offensive, doubtful, sometimes actually forbidden, at least according to the notions of the great majority of English Churchmen, if he would always do so in a tentative, paltering way, seldom or never letting the world know how much he believed, how far he intended to go, if, in a word, his method of teaching was a suspicious one, what wonder if the mind of men were filled with suspicions of him? Page 17. Now, in the course of my narrative, I have frankly admitted that I was tentative in such of my works as fairly allowed of the introduction into them of religious inquiry. But he is speaking of my sermons. Where then is his proof that in my sermons I dealt in matters dark, offensive, doubtful, actually forbidden? He must show that I was tentative in my sermons, and he has the range of 8 volumes to gather evidence in. As to the 9th, my University sermons, of course I was tentative in them, but not because I would seldom or never let the world know how much I believed, or how far I intended to go, but because University sermons are commonly and allowably of the nature of disquisition, as preached before a learned body, and because in deep subjects, which had not been fully investigated, I said as much as I believe, and about as far as I saw I could go, and a man cannot do more, and I account no man to be a philosopher who attempts to do more. End of Note C. To Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Cardinal Newman. Note D of Apologia Pro Vita Sua, by John Henry Cardinal Newman. Note D. Series of Saints' Lives of 1843-1844. I have here an opportunity of preserving, what otherwise would be lost, the catalogue of English saints which I formed as preparatory to the series of their lives which was begun in the above years. It is but my first essay, and has many obvious imperfections, but it may be useful to others as a step towards a complete hagiography for England. For instance, St. Osberga is omitted, I suppose because it was not easy to learn anything about her. Boniface of Canterbury is inserted, though passed over by the Bollanders on the ground of the absence of proof of a cultus having been paid to him. The Saints of Cornwall were too numerous to be attempted. Among the men of note, not saints, King Edward II is included from piety toward the founder of Oriel College. With these admissions, I present my paper to the reader. Preparing for publications in periodical numbers, in small 8 vo, The Lives of English Saints, edited by John Henry Newman, B.D., Fellow of Oriel College. It is the compensation of the disorders and perplexities of these latter times of the Church that we have the history of the foregoing. We indeed of this day have been reserved to witness the disorganization of the City of God, which it never entered into the minds of the early believers to imagine. But we are witness also of its triumphs and of its luminaries through those many ages, which have brought about the misfortunes which at present overshadow it. If they were blessed who lived in primitive times, and saw the fresh traces of their Lord, and hear the echoes of apostolic voices, blessed too are we whose special portion it is to see that same Lord revealed in His saints. The wonder of His grace in the soul of man, its creative power, its inexhaustible resource, its manifold operation, all this we know, as they knew it not. They never heard the names of St. Gregory, St. Bernard, St. Francis, and St. Louis. In fixing our thoughts then, as in the undertaking like the present, on the history of the saints, we are but availing ourselves of the solace and recompense of our peculiar trials, which has been provided for our needs by our gracious Master. And there are special reasons at this time for recurring to the saints of our own dear and glorious, most favoured, yet most erring and most unfortunate England. Such a recurrence may serve to make us love our country better, and on truer grounds, than heretofore, to teach us to invest her territory, her cities and villages, her hills and springs, with sacred associations, to give us an insight into her present historical position in the course of the divine dispensation, to instruct us in the capabilities of the English character, and to open upon us the duties and the hopes to which the Church is heir, which was in former times the mother of St. Boniface and St. Ethelreda. Even a selection of the specimens of the hagiology of our country may suffice for some of these high purposes, and in so wide and rich a field of research, it is almost presumptuous in one undertaking to aim at more than such a partial exhibition. The list that follows, though by no means is so large as might have been drawn up, exceeds the limits which the editor proposes to his hopes, if not his wishes, but, whether it is allowed him to accomplish a larger or smaller portion of it, it will be his aim to complete such subjects or periods as he begins before bringing it to a close. It is hardly necessary to observe that any list that is producible in this stage of the undertaking can but approximate to correctness and completeness in matters of detail, and even in the names which are selected to compose it. He had considered himself at liberty to include in the series such saints as have been born in England, though they have lived and laboured out of it, and such again as have been in any sufficient way connected with our country, though born out of it, for instance missionaries or preachers in it, or spiritual or temporal rulers, or founders of religious institutions or houses. He has also included in the series a few eminent or holy persons, who, though not in the sacred catalogue, are recommended to our religious memory by their fame, learning, or the benefits they have conferred on posterity. These have been distinguished from the saints by printing their names in italics. It is proposed to page all the longer lives separately. The shorter will be thrown together in one. They will be published in monthly issues of not more than 128 pages each, and no regularity, whether of date or of subject, will be observed in the order of publication, but they will be so numbered as to admit ultimately of a general chronological arrangement. The separate writers are distinguished by letters subjoined to each life, and it should be added, to prevent misapprehensions, that since under the present circumstances of our Church, they are necessarily of various, though not divergent, doctrinal opinions, no one is answerable for any composition but his own. At the same time, the work professing an historical and ethical character, questions of theology will be, as far as possible, thrown into the background. John Henry Newman, Littlemore, September 9th, 1843. End of Apologia Pro Vita Sua by John Henry Cardinal Newman. Recorded by Bill McGilvray of Hingham, Massachusetts, December 2010.